Okay, please open to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And before we move on to the next topic, a few weeks ago, Seng asked about a passage or raised a question about a passage. And I told him that I would talk about it. And he probably thought I forgot, but I didn't. So I want to talk about that passage and another one today and probably next week. And the reason Seng brought this up, well, I didn't talk about it initially because usually when I see people giving verses that they use to teach an imminent rapture, they don't usually mention this passage. So that's why I didn't initially talk about it. But as you will see, when people do read or talk about this passage, which is frankly not very often, but when they do, they do sometimes teach or at least wonder if this passage is teaching an imminent coming or at least a soon coming of Christ. So that's why it's relevant for what we've been talking about. And so the passage again is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I will read beginning in verse 29. So let me get verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. And so, of course, I'm not going to go back in the chapter and spend a long time seeing the context here, but you can somewhat see the context just from these few verses. And overall, in a general sense, this chapter is dealing with marriage, separation, divorce, and remarriage. But that's not our primary interest in going to this passage now. It's rather to take note in verse 29, Paul says the time is short. And then in verse 31, he says the fashion of this world passeth away. So that's why Seng brought up this passage, and that's why we're going to talk about it a bit. So first of all, again, in verse 29, Paul says the time is short. And there are a few interpretations of what Paul means there. One interpretation is that Paul is saying the time is short until we die. And so therefore, he would be saying, since life is short, it's better not to marry. But I think that's highly unlikely that that's what Paul is saying here. Because if that's what Paul is saying, then he would have to advise that no one marry ever, any time or any place. Because we know back early in the Old Testament, people lived long lifespans, hundreds of years. But since roughly the time of Abraham, that hasn't been the case. Man's life has been short as it is now. In chapter 7, again, Jean Gross, would you read verse 26?
Okay, 1 Corinthians 7:26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be.
So another thing I think that's key to understanding this passage is in verse 26, Paul speaks of the present distress. And we'll maybe talk a bit more about that later, although it won't be a major focus. But whatever the present distress is, it's clearly not the shortness of life that we have. So again, it's been a reality that man's life has been short from, again, roughly from the time of Abraham, and that will continue to be the case until the second coming of Christ. So again, if that's what Paul means when he says the time is short and therefore advises not to marry, again, he would have to advise throughout the entire dispensation of grace in every place that no one should marry, because the lifespan has roughly not changed again since the time of Abraham. But it's clear that that's not what Paul teaches about marriage. Even in this same chapter, if you go back to the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Richard, would you read the first two verses? Okay, I'm not sure if Richard is there, so let me read. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and beginning in verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. So at the beginning of this chapter, Paul advises getting married. And we could look at other passages also, but certainly Paul does not teach or advise that no one get married throughout the dispensation of grace because our lives are short. So again, I think it's highly unlikely. In fact, I think it's clearly incorrect to say that in verse 29, when Paul says the time is short, that he's talking about the shortness of our lifespans. And also, I think with the phrase the present distress in verse 26, I think also the phrase the time is short in verse 29, I believe both of those phrases refer to something specific going on in Corinth at the time that Paul wrote this. I don't think that those phrases are general teachings applying to all times and all places. So that's again one interpretation of verse 29. The time is short, that he's saying our lifespans are short, but I think that's clearly not correct. Another interpretation of the phrase "the time is short" is that Paul is saying the time is short until the present distress ends. Now that seems much more likely to me that would fit the context, and it would fit the idea that there was some temporary present distress in Corinth at this time that would lead Paul to give the advice that he gives here. But his advice then would be only for enduring this relatively brief time in Corinth when this present distress was taking place. But then he would be saying, regarding this present distress, the time is short. So it's not going to go on and on and on and on. It's going to come to an end. And so again, his advice is only for a short time while the present distress is taking place. So that's a second interpretation that I think is much more likely correct. And then a third interpretation, and this is the reason why we're going to this passage, is that there are some who interpret that phrase in verse 29, the time is short, as referring to the second coming of Christ. And some also try to tie in that phrase, the present distress, with the second coming of Christ. So in other words, then they would say that in verse 29, Paul is saying the time is short until the second coming of Christ. All right, so turn to Romans chapter 13. So we're going to later come back to 1 Corinthians 7 and talk about this and look at this more carefully. But many times when people are talking about 1 Corinthians 7, those verses, they will give a couple verses in Romans 13 as a cross reference, where they say Paul is saying the same thing or something similar in Romans 13. So Romans chapter 13, and Meg, would you read verses 11 and 12?
That, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light.
So again, some interpret the verses we read in 1 Corinthians 7, and then also these verses that Meg just read, as Paul teaching that the coming of Christ is going to be soon, or that it's imminent. So when Paul says in verse 11, he says, and that knowing the time. So we know the time, at least when we come to chapter 13 here. And I believe he's referring back particularly to Romans chapter 8, 9, 10, 11. Because in those chapters, he gives a considerable amount of detail about God's work in the past, what he did in the past, and what he's doing now, and what he will do in the world to come. So there's a lot of information about time past, now, and things to come in those chapters. So now by the time we come to chapter 13, we ought to understand the time in which we are now living. And so since we know the time in which we are now living, Paul says in verse 11 that it's time to, it's high time to awake out of sleep. Again, since we know the time. If you turn back for a moment to chapter 8 in Romans, one aspect of this knowing the time, I believe, are verses that we just talked about in Romans 8. So I won't spend a long time on this, but just to refresh your memories and tie it into this context in chapter 13. So Romans chapter 8, and Dick, would you read verses 21 and 22?
Okay, Romans 8, 21 and 22. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now.
And incidentally, notice that word know, for we know. So one thing that we know about the time is that at this time, the whole creation is groaning in pain. And then again in Romans chapter 8, would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 23?
And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body.
All right, so another thing that we know about the time is that we know that we believers also, are groaning as we wait for the redemption of our body. And then again in Romans 8, Paul, would you read verses 24 and 25?
For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that which we see not, then do we with patience wait for it.
And so as we have spoken about in the last couple of weeks, the fact that we know that the whole creation is groaning in pain now, and we also are groaning in pain, that should not cause us to be in a panic, but it should cause us to patiently wait. So these are some of the things, when you come to chapter 13, and Paul says that we know the time, this would be some of the information that we know about the time. Then go back to Romans 13. And so again, knowing the time should not cause us to panic or be discouraged, but it should cause us to wake up and to be alert. And so in Romans 13, again, the verses in particular that we're looking at are verses 11 and 12. But in Romans 13, Dominic, would you read verses 8 through 10?
No man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, nor thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in the saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law.
And then he says, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. So knowing the time, we should not take sin lightly. We should take heed to the verses that Dominic just read. And then we're going to come back to Romans 13 in a moment, but turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, and Sharon, would you read verse 13?
But all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light, for whatsoever doth make manifest is light.
Okay, so when day comes, of course, there's light, and light makes our deeds manifest. And so he says in verse 13 that all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. And so take notice of that deeds being made manifest when there's light. And then again in Ephesians chapter 5, would Dan or Lisa read verse 14?
Wherefore he saith, Awake, thou sleepest, and arise from the dead. Christ shall give thee light.
So notice Paul says, awake, thou that sleepest. And so before I comment further, again, so this is in Romans 13, he talks about how we should, knowing the time, we should wake up. And so here also in verse 14, he says, awake, thou that sleepest. And then again in Ephesians chapter 5, Pakinatan, would you read verses 15 and 16?
Walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as redeeming the time, because the days are evil.
Okay, so Paul tells us that we must be careful how we walk, and we must redeem the time because we know that the days are evil. So Paul here is also talking about basically saying you know the time in which you are living. For example, he says the days are evil. And so knowing these things, awake thou that sleepest. Okay, then before we go back to Romans, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And would Dan or Laura read verse 34?
15:34. Awake to righteousness and sin not, for some have not the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame.
All right, so he says, awake to righteousness. So there are a number of times where Paul uses this kind of terminology, basically telling us to wake up to righteousness, to avoid the evil because the days are evil and so forth. All right, then back in Romans 13, and again in verse 11, he says, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. And I think the verses that we just looked at help us to understand what Paul means when he says it's high time to awake out of sleep. Now, in this context, in this passage, why does Paul say that it's high time to awake out of sleep? He says in verse 11, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. So in this verse, that's the reason he gives for why we should awake out of sleep. And I believe the salvation he's talking about in verse 11, when he says our salvation is nearer than when we believe, I believe he's talking about the salvation that we just read about in Romans chapter 8, the redemption of our bodies. So he's not talking about salvation in the sense of eternal life, because we already have that now. We're not waiting. We don't have to wait patiently for that. We can rejoice in that now. So again, I believe the salvation he's talking about here would refer back to the redemption of our bodies in Romans 8. And so his point here in verse 11 is that every day the redemption of our body draws nearer. And so it's no time to be sleeping. And of course, that's clearly true. For example, today, we are all one day closer to death than we were yesterday. And also today, we are one day closer to the redemption of our bodies than we were yesterday. So that, I think that's simply the point that Paul's making there. And since the days are counting down and it's getting nearer, it's no time to be sleeping. So I don't believe this has anything to do with Paul saying that Christ's coming is soon or that the rapture is imminent. I don't think Paul's talking about that at all here. He's merely saying that our salvation is nearer than when we believed. And every day it gets nearer and nearer. And also remember, just 2 chapters before this, in chapter 11 in Romans, I believe Paul clearly dispelled any idea that the coming of Christ was imminent. All right, then in Romans chapter 13, and then going on to verse 12, Paul says, the night is far spent. All right, so what's he talking about there? All right, turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 9. The Gospel of John, chapter 9. And George, would you read verses 4 and 5 in John chapter 9?
I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
All right, so notice here that Jesus said that it was day when he was on earth. So here in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when he was on earth, he says it was day. And then look back in the previous chapter, John chapter 8. John chapter 8, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 12?
John 8:12. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
All right, so he also says here, I am the light of the world. And of course, light would be associated with day. And so those who followed him would have the light of life. Then also go back to chapter 1 in John, in the Gospel of John. John chapter 1. And Richard, if you're there now, would you read verses 4 through 7 in John chapter 1? Okay, maybe not there yet. So, all right, so John chapter 1 and beginning in verse 4. In him, and of course it's talking about Christ, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. And so here also Christ is spoken of as the light. And so Christ was a light shining in the darkness. When Christ came to earth in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he brought a brief time of day. And when he left the world, the day was gone. The light ascended up into heaven, was off the earth. And then turn to Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4, and Meg, would you read the first 2 verses?
For 1 and 2. For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall.
All right, so he's speaking here. He says in verse 1, the day cometh, and he's speaking here about the second coming of Christ. And notice in verse 2, it speaks of the second coming of Christ in the terms of, it says, shall the Son of Righteousness arise. And notice the word son there is not S-O-N, but S-U-N. And so the second coming of Christ here is spoken of in terms of the coming of the day, the daytime, when the sun arises. Then turn to 2 Peter chapter 1. 2 Peter chapter 1, and Dick, would you read verse 19? 2 Peter 1:19.
Okay, 2 Peter, excuse me, 2 Peter 1, verse 19. Here we go. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that you take heed, and unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn, and the day star arise in your hearts.
Okay, notice Christ here is referred to as the day star. And then Revelation chapter 22. Revelation chapter 22. And would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 16?
I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star.
Okay, so in this verse, Christ is referred to as the bright and morning star. Then go back once again to the Gospel of John, chapter 9. John chapter 9, and again in verses 4 and 5. So John chapter 9, verse 4, he says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. So again, clearly when Christ was on earth here, it was day. And then he says, the night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So the night that Christ spoke about here in verse 4, I believe is the coming time of Israel's great tribulation. That will specifically be the night. And so Christ could not have been talking here in John 9 about the dispensation of grace, because the dispensation of grace was a mystery when Christ spoke these words. So when he was on earth, he said it was day. And then when he says the night is coming, he's referring to the fact that he's going to leave the earth, and then that time of Israel's great tribulation will come, and that will be night. All right, then go back to Romans 13. Romans 13, and again in verse 12, Paul says, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. So I believe in verse 12, when Paul says the night is far spent, I don't believe that he's talking about dispensationally or prophetically, or trying to tie this in with the second coming of Christ. For one thing, if that's what Paul's saying here, then we would pretty well know now that this verse is not true, because we know now that it's been many hundreds of years since Paul wrote Romans, and still Christ has not come. So that would be one of the problems with trying to say that Paul is speaking here prophetically about the coming of Christ. We now know that the dispensation of grace has continued around 2,000 years. So it's hard to see how Paul could have in Romans here been talking about the night is far spent in that sense. So I believe Paul is talking here about our personal walk, as the other passages we looked at in Ephesians and 1 Corinthians. And so regarding our personal walk and knowing the time, understanding the time in which we're living, the days are evil, we're to wait patiently for the redemption of our body, knowing those things, it's not a time to be sleeping. It's a time to be awake and to be alert. And then look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and beginning in verse 4. He says, but ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. Ye are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. So if we take the statement that Christ made in John 9, where he said when he was on earth, this is day, and then he says the night is coming. If we take that to mean the dispensation of grace, then first of all, we would have the problem of Christ speaking about the dispensation of grace prior to Paul, and we know that was not the case because it was a mystery. But also it would conflict with this passage in 1 Thessalonians 5, because Paul says here that we are not in darkness, and that we are children of the light and children of the day, and we are not of the night nor of darkness. All right, then go back to Romans 13. So there are a number of problems with trying to understand these verses in Romans 13 as being prophetic regarding the second coming of Christ. Okay, then again in Romans 13 and verse 12, he says, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. So again, if we take this to be a dispensational statement or a statement about the second coming of Christ, dispensationally, the day will not come until Christ returns, as we read, for example, in Malachi. And so Paul knows that we must patiently wait for the redemption of our bodies, as we've seen in Romans chapter 8. And so he also knows that this dispensation will not conclude until the church, the body of Christ, no longer continues in God's goodness. We've talked about that in some detail, but just to refresh your memory a bit, turn back to Romans 11. Romans chapter 11, and Paul, would you read verses 20 through 22 in Romans 11?
Verses 20 to 22. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold therefore the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off.
And again, we talked about these verses in some detail recently, so I won't spend a long time here now, but I believe Paul is clearly teaching here that the dispensation of grace will end when the body of Christ is no longer continuing in his goodness. But as long as the body of Christ is continuing in his goodness, the dispensation of grace will continue. And again, Paul tells us in chapter 8 to wait patiently for the redemption of our body. So again, if you turn back to chapter 13 in Romans, again in Romans chapter 13, verses 11 and 12, if we interpret that to mean that the dispensation of grace is nearly at an end and Christ is coming very soon, that would really contradict what he just said in chapter 8 and chapter 11, for example. And also, we know, and Paul knew when he wrote Romans, that there are prophetic events that must take place before the coming of Christ. For example, the 70th week of Daniel, and so forth. So before and again, the reason that's relevant is the second coming of Christ is spoken of as the coming of daytime. And so that coming of daytime cannot happen until other prophetic events are first fulfilled. So again, I don't believe that Paul is speaking dispensationally in these verses or prophetically about the coming of Christ, but I think he's talking about our personal walk, that it's time to wake up, be alert. And so because the night is far spent and the day is at hand, he says there are two things that we should do. So in Romans chapter 13, verse 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. So again, knowing the time, knowing these things, we should cast off the works of darkness. So light and darkness exist on earth at this time, and we should live in the light, not in the darkness. And we've looked at some passages already in Ephesians 5, for example. But look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and Dominic, would you read verse 14?
Second Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Sorry. But be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness?
So Paul says, what communion hath light with darkness? And the correct answer is none. It's not supposed to have, light is not supposed to have any communion with darkness. And so again, here, he's not talking about he's not talking about dispensationally, this is night, this is light, this is darkness. He's not talking about that at all. He's again talking about our walk. And then go back again to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And this passage, I think, is very relevant to what Paul's saying in Romans 13. So just looking at this again, Ephesians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 6. He says, let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. And so, again, the way he speaks here about light and darkness, I believe is also the way he's using those terms in Romans 13. Okay, then go back again to Romans 13. And so in Romans 13, Dominic read some of this earlier, but in Romans 13, again, if you look at verse 9, he says, for this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So again, clearly in the context, he's talking about our walk. And then, and so these things in verse 9 that he says, thou shalt not this, thou shalt not that, those would all be examples of works of darkness that we should not partake in. And then also in Romans 13, and Sharon, would you read verse 13? So Romans chapter 13, verse 13.
Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying.
Okay, so again, you see he's talking here in this passage about our walk. He says, let us walk honestly. And then he says, as in the day. And then he gives more examples of works of darkness, rioting, drunkenness, chambering, and so forth. Turn to, and we're going to come right back here, but turn to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. And Pakinatan, would you read verses 12 and 13 in Colossians chapter 1?
Which hath made us meet be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son.
All right, so he says that we have been made partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. And then in verse 13, he says, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. And so again, that would be a similar use of talking about light and darkness and day and night, to what Paul does in Romans 13 and Ephesians 5 and other places. All right, then go back again to Romans 13. And so in light of these things, he says, again, there are two things that we should do in verse 12. Number one, cast off the works of darkness. And number two, let us put on the armor of light. So in Romans 13, verse 13 again, Paul says we are to walk as in the day. And so I believe that that further shows that Paul is not using these terms in a dispensational way in this passage, saying this time was day and this time is night and so on and so forth. Because he doesn't say in verse 13 that we are to walk in the day, but he says as in the day. And so the day, if you look back to, for example, what we read in Ephesians 5, the day is when the light makes our works manifest. So it can be seen what we do. And the night is when you can do things without being seen. You can do things secretly, privately, without anyone knowing about it. And so that's what he means when he says in verse 13, we are to live as in the day, not secretly, privately do the works of darkness. So we should walk according to the position that we have in Christ, according to who we are in Christ. So again, I don't believe that in Romans chapter 13, I don't believe that verses 11 and 12 are any kind of a prophetic statement about the second coming of Christ or the 70th week of Daniel. And therefore, I don't believe that these verses would support the idea that the phrase in 1 Corinthians 7, the time is short, is referring to the second coming of Christ. Let's turn back there to 1 Corinthians 7. But if we're going to interpret 1 Corinthians 7 in that manner, I don't think Romans 13 would support that interpretation. And so we'll just a brief comment and we'll stop for today. And then next week, we'll look a little bit more at this 1 Corinthians 7 passage. But in addition to what we've talked about today, there are other complications with interpreting this phrase in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 29, the time is short, to mean that Paul is saying the time is short until the second coming of Christ. And let me just mention one more before we conclude. So it's one thing to say that Paul personally, during his early ministry, may have thought that the second coming of Christ could be relatively soon, that he may still be alive at the time of Christ's coming. And I think that's possible. I think it's kind of hard to prove, but I think it's possible. But that's one thing to say that. But it's another thing to say that he received a revelation saying that. So it's another thing to say that Paul wrote here, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7, that the time until Christ's second coming is short, or until his coming is short, because he's writing this by inspiration of God. And again, from our perspective now, we know that we're roughly 2,000 years later, and still the coming of Christ has not taken place. So it'd be kind of hard if you interpret Paul to be saying that. It'd be kind of hard to avoid concluding that Paul made a mistake here, which, it's no big deal if Paul made a mistake. We all make mistakes. But again, he's writing this by inspiration of God. So that would be a big deal to claim that something written by inspiration of God is a mistake. So that's, I think, another major problem with interpreting this, interpreting that Paul is saying here that the time is short until the second coming of Christ. And in fact, there are people, Bible critics, who use this as an example of a mistake in the Bible, because they claim that Paul is saying that the time is short until the coming of Christ. And now we're many hundreds of years later, we know, in fact, that when Paul wrote this, it was not short. And so I don't believe that's what Paul's talking about here at all. All right, we will stop there for today. And again, next week, we'll look a little bit more at this 1 Corinthians 7 passage. So thank you all.